All right, guys, I want to do a brief overview of one of my favorite books. It's Knowledge of the Holy by A.W. Tozer. There's basically the thumbnail of this is it's a look at the attributes of God. And a lot of things in here. It says we tend by secret law to move towards our mental image of God. I think that that's a right statement, and so to think correctly about who God is and his attributes is important. And he also says that a real idea of God may lie buried under our religious notions and we require extensive search. So it is important we know what we actually believe about God. So he talks about thinking rightly about God, that God is incomprehensible. This is a very interesting idea, and it's clear that when the Bible uses terminology to describe God, they don't use exact ideas. The appearance of, the likeness of, and so it's not an exact image. So when we're in the image of God, we're not exactly like God. We don't look exactly like we. So I think that's an important concept. So an attribute of God is only means that whatever can be correctly said to be ascribed to God. Talks about the self-existence of God. He doesn't require anybody else. He doesn't need anybody else. That's the self-sufficiency of God. God is eternal. I think one of the things that he talks about, that I've talked about before, is that God is outside of time, and that he is separate from our existence. That it says all within us cries for life of permanence, and everything around us reminds us of the mortality and change in life, and God is completely separate from all of that. The world we live in is not the world of God. He is in a separate place outside of time. He's not bound by our mortality. So his infinitude is one thing that it talks about, that although our natural life runs through a cycle, his life does not run through a cycle. He doesn't change. That's the immutability of God. And the immutability of God appears in its most perfect beauty when viewed against the mutability of man. In God, no change is possible. And for us as humans, change is impossible to escape. God's omniscience, he knows all things, and that comes because he's outside of time and he sees all things as they've happened as 1,000 years as if they had already passed. That's Psalm 94. We talked about that in the video predestination or free will, or we talked about that. So he looks at things from a different perspective than we do. God is full of wisdom because he understands everything he does, and He made us, so he understands this fully. I watched a video about the creator of Pac-Man. The creator of Pac-Man couldn't even beat Pac-Man. God's not like that. He understands fully his creation. He is omnipotent, means he's all-powerful. He's able to do everything that he desires. There's nothing held back from him. He transcends all things. God is in and through all things. God's omnipresence. I'll keep my thoughts on that to myself, but I understand that probably a little differently than most people. He's completely faithful. He knows he's completely faithful because he's seen himself do all the things that he's done. He's outside of the linear time frame. God is the standard to which we describe goodness. And the problem is that when we describe the goodness of God, we describe it according to our standards, what we think is good. God's above that. His standard is supposed to be our standard, not the other way around. We don't judge God by our standards, what we think love is, what we think tolerance is, what we think loving kindness is. No, it's according to his standards, and that's how we are to act. The problem is we've let the world decide what is good, and then we judge God on what the world's standards are for goodness. That's not right. Justice. The justice of God is according to his standards. And one of the beautiful things that I've seen is studying the law of God in the Old Testament law and seeing how righteous the justice of God is. I think that is missed by most Christians because most Christians don't dwell on the minutiae in the law when they should, because there is a beauty there that David saw. David said it delighted his heart, the righteousness of God and the goodness of God and his justice. Why doesn't it delight our hearts to see the righteousness of God and his justice? We all understand about the mercy of God and grace of God. Those are things that the modern church talks a lot about. But you got to understand the full nature of God in his different attributes. I think that's one of the things that this book does well, is talk on the different aspects of God and not just the positive ones that the world would say was positive. So I'd recommend this book to check it out. No matter which stripe or version you are, to dwell on the name of God is beneficial. And the attributes of God, to have a more correct picture of God, it's helpful to dwell on these different attributes, at least all the ones I mentioned.